There are many shows dedicated to Magic the Gathering strategies, decks, and formats. But unlike all of them, this channel is about discussing an individual card, an isolated card, an unrelated card. This is an Magic Card. Hello and welcome to episode number 3 of An Magic Card. I am Dusty Cupboards, and as always, and I use that phrase ironically, because I've literally only done this once before, I shall begin by looking over some of the comments for the last video. Joshua Haugen said, I would like to see some of the other artwork, or some of the same art from the artist. Thank you for this input. I had originally considered doing something like this, showcasing a wide range of pieces, but I thought it might detract too much from the specific artwork I was discussing. In the future, I will try and at least briefly show some of the other work from the artist's catalog, as I agree that it makes the broader discussion of their style more readily understood. IRL Fine Gaming pointed out that original Zendikar block and Khans block also broke the block structure by being a large set followed by a small set followed by another large set. This is true, and a great representation of how needlessly complicated everything about Magic has to be. BBBEware said, okay, keep going. Okay, I will. But before we get to the main topic for today, I feel like I owe it to you all to address some statements I made in the last video. At multiple points in episode 2, I recommended the 1998 film adaptation of the classic science fiction TV show Lost in Space. I thought it would be only fair for me to rewatch that movie and come back here with a more informed take. I'm not going to get into all of the details, and I'm not going to explicitly say that my 10-year-old opinion was wrong, but I would like to point out that I had completely forgotten about the CGI space monkey, and that sometimes people, not specifically me, but people in general, remember things as being better than they actually are. And now on to our main topic, one of the most controversial cards in the history of Magic. Alright, we find ourselves once again back at the Gatherer page for our old friend Talara's Bane. And now we will engage in the incredibly scientific methodology for determining this week's card, which involves clicking on this little button here. Just gotta click this little button. Little button. Okay. There it is. It's a scarecrow. Community loves this card. Look at this community rating. Geist-Fueled Scarecrow is a 4-mana uncommon 4/4 artifact creature from Eldritch Moon, the 71st expansion in the esteemed history of the most successful of all Deckmaster games. Eldritch Moon released on Friday, July 22nd, 2016, which compared to the other sets we've discussed previously, feels like it was just yesterday. For the record though, it was not yesterday. This is the part of the video where I normally give some context about what life was like way back on Friday, July 22nd, 2016. Maybe I should talk about how a frickin' Star Trek movie released. Movies often come out on Fridays. Star Trek is good. Star Trek Beyond was okay. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has an 86%, which I feel like might be a little bit generous. Apparently, Carl Urban was in that movie. Carl Urban has the uncanny ability to be in things without you realizing he is in them. He was also in Dread, which I referenced in my last video, and I would not have remembered that if I wasn't looking directly at his IMDb page as I write this. Also on July 22nd, 2016, Hillary Clinton announced her running mate. Remember Tim Kaine? I most certainly don't. According to the internet, he can play the harmonica though, which is actually pretty impressive because I've tried to play the harmonica on many occasions and it generally just sounds like sheet metal scraping across rubble. I used to keep a harmonica in my car and I would try to play it while sitting at red lights. I thought this would enable me to learn how to play the harmonica while also making good use of otherwise wasted time. I'm not going to flat out say that it was a bad idea, but I also definitely still don't know how to play the harmonica. While doing my extensive, laborious, and highly scientific research for this section about the historical date of July 22nd, 2016, I stumbled upon a factoid, which is so monumentally astounding to me that it completely removes any passing interest I might have had in the odd forgettability of both Tim Urban and Carl Kaine. As I sit alone in my cold office writing this on Thanksgiving Day, it is exactly 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days since July 22nd, 2016. This slot machine jackpot-like number itself seems notably serendipitous, but the real coincidence becomes evident only when you return your gaze to the card we have selected for this episode. Geist-Fueled Scarecrow is a 4-mana 4/4. That's right, today we are discussing a 4-mana 4/4 that released exactly 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days ago. This numerological alignment strikes me as so unlikely and so perfectly symmetrical that it makes me wonder if the random card button on Gatherer functions not off some random number generating algorithm, but some deep cosmological truth which underpins every facet of our short lives and the entirety of the ever-expanding universe. Eldritch Moon was the second, smaller set from the Shadows over Innistrad block. Unlike Lorwyn Shadowmoor, which we've discussed before, this block is not an outlier, as it was released when 2-set blocks were the normal. Shadows over Innistrad block takes place on Innistrad, which we had previously visited in the appropriately named Innistrad block 5 years earlier in 2011. That block was a 3-set block. The plane of Innistrad is among the spookiest, and not just at night. The gothic horror theme pervades every aspect of life on Innistrad, with vampires, werewolves, zombies, and ghosts preying upon the human residents of the world in a constant, nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse. The tension and paranoia this horror movie atmosphere lends the place made it a prime candidate for the bewildering intervention of the multiverse's most mind-boggling spaghetti monster, which I guess means I need to actually explain a little bit about Emrakul. Do I though? I guess Emrakul is literally depicted in the set symbol. Maybe we can just craft one brilliant sentence that summarizes the entirety of both Zendikar blocks and the complicated relationship between the Eldrazi and the ancient planeswalkers who confusingly refer to themselves as the Three. Here we go. 3 big non-Euclidean beings from beyond the bounds of reality, long consumed worlds until 3 planeswalkers imprisoned them within the plane of Zendikar, but they escaped and were fought by a new group of planeswalkers who killed 2 of them, with only the biggest one, Emrakul, managing to abscond. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. So Emrakul has the funny habit of making people go insane, and that's exactly what we see in Shadows over Innistrad block. The gothic horror world of Innistrad turns into a world of psychological horror, body horror, and cosmic horror. The word Eldritch is worth delving into a little bit, as it's not something that is thrown around casually. According to an academic paper which I discovered while combing through an old etymological library, the word Eldritch is the name of a 2013 first-person shooter game. It's also an adjective which means weird and sinister or ghostly. Apparently the word can be traced back to 16th century English, where it probably had something to do with elves. And wowza, the usage of it has really shot up in the last 25 years. Stuff has been getting a lot more Eldritch lately. All of this is kind of secondary though, because when somebody uses the word Eldritch, they aren't actually trying to communicate that it is weird and sinister or ghostly, even if that is what the term more specifically means. 100% of the time, the word Eldritch is used to reference American author H.P. Lovecraft. Wizards of the Coast couldn't name the set Lovecraftian Moon, but that is definitely what the word Eldritch is meant to imply. Howard Phillips Lovecraft enjoyed writing horror fiction, like his novella, The Shadow over Innsmouth, which is so similar to the words Shadows over Innistrad that I don't even really know why I'm taking the time to point it out, but I feel like I still have to point it out, so this is me pointing it out. That novella, like many of his works, are considered part of the Cthulhu mythos, which I might be mispronouncing, but I don't care. The Cthulhu mythos is Lovecraft's signature brand of unfathomable, fishy space religion horror stuff. If I wanted to spend an entire 30 minutes pointing out the obvious references to specific H.P. Lovecraft stories contained within Shadows over Innistrad block, I could do so, and if you tempt me, I will. But ultimately, it would be quite tedious. The important thing to note though is that despite the Cthulhu mythos being one author's signature setting, in the past, well, I guess 25 years, based on this chart, it has become more or less accepted as an entire genre of horror that people are free to tap into willy-nilly. While the Eldrazi have always been deeply influenced by this specific brand of spooky gibberish, it's in Shadows over Innistrad block where the feeling of an H.P. Lovecraft story really comes to life. The sense of foreboding and unknowable horror is central to the block, and it wasn't initially even clear that it was Emrakul that was causing the madness, although I recall very specifically that most people had a hunch. Overall, I'm not a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft, and I'm not one to enthusiastically engage with the pop cultural phenomenon his world building has subsequently spawned, but Shadows over Innistrad block frickin' slapped, and I had a good time drafting it. Also, H.P. Lovecraft was a big-time racist bunghole, so keep that in mind whenever you're consuming any of his hard-to-pronounce nonsense. Also, every picture I've ever seen of H.P. Lovecraft, he looks like he is just about to break down crying. I don't know if this is a criticism against him, but it is definitely a thing. Among the many Lovecraftian, tentacle-laden, and terror-inducing cards from Eldritch Moon, there are also a number of classic standbys from Gothic horror that are still kicking around. Included among those old classics are spooky scarecrows, which are also well known from their presence on Lorwyn_Shadowmoor. It's neat how things come back around like that. Card number 196 out of 205 in Eldritch Moon is Geist-Fueled Scarecrow, right after Field Creeper, another Scarecrow, and preceding Lupine Prototype, which is a goddamn wolf robot. A very cool looking wolf robot. Man, that's a cool looking wolf robot. Geistfield Scarecrow could be abbreviated as GFS. If anybody ever talked about it enough, although I guess that's kind of what I'm doing right now. The word Geist is German for ghost, and should clue you in to the Germanic influence present on Innistrad. The word Gothic, as used in Gothic horror, is itself derived from the word Goth, which references the Gothic people from which Germanic tribes descended, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Crimean Goths. The Goths, which you knew in middle school, or perhaps the Goth you were in middle school, are so called because of their love of the dark and macabre, which ties them to the Gothic fiction genres that were born out of varied Germanic traditions. You've got your Draculas and your Frankensteins and your spooky ravens. Neither Edgar Allan Poe or Bram Stoker or the absolute legend Mary Shelley, who invented science fiction when she was 19 years old, were actually German themselves though, but they wrote stories which took place in Gothic-style buildings and read German ghost stories while sitting around a crackling fireplace, kept sequestered indoors by dreary downpours, and left to entertain themselves by discussing the nature of life and the popular new field of galvanism. It's interesting to me that for many historical figures, they are often best recognized by a single depiction, which becomes their iconic likeness. As previously discussed, with H.P. Lovecraft, it's kind of irrelevant because all of his pictures show the same awkward-looking racist crybaby. But for somebody like Mary Shelley, her most famous look is a painting done by Richard Rothwell. The portrait was done with Shelley sitting as a live model, so her likeness can be trusted to be accurate. She has a pretty distinct set of features: very large downward sloping eyes, a long nose, and a small furrowed mouth. Beyond her actual facial structure though, she also has a very memorable outfit, a shoulderless black dress that dips dramatically in the middle. Her dark hair is slick and neatly pulled down around her face, creating the appearance of large curls that frame her exposed forehead and strong cheekbones. It is hard to look at this depiction for any length of time and not see a striking similarity to Magic's most famous necromancer, who, like Shelley herself, wondered if perhaps the medicine utilized to sustain life could also be used to bring back the dead. And just as Frankenstein is a lightning-powered corpse, the Geistfield Scarecrow is a lifeless assemblage which has been brought into the messy world of the living through some kind of mad science. There are numerous geists, or ghosts, on the Gothic plane of Innistrad, and lots of them get cards of their own. We have also been shown many times in the past that in Magic the Gathering, scarecrows can just heckin' get funky on their own. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So it's a bit strange that somebody would decide to power a scarecrow with the otherworldly energy from a ghost. But then again, most other scarecrows don't have propeller hands and a giant wheel to roll around on. In the past 2 videos, I've discussed the card art near the end, but the illustration here is so ridiculous that I feel like I just need to address it now to stop everybody from staring at it with bewilderment for the next 10 minutes. This piece was done by Adam Paquette, who has done 162 illustrations for Magic the Gathering, which is a ton. If you don't recognize his name, that means you're ungrateful, because he has blessed us with such bangers as Parhellion 2, Damping Sphere, and Spellqueller. Looking over his catalog, he seems to have a lot of robots and a lot of landscapes, including a suspicious number of robots that roll around on big wheels. I'm on to you, Adam. Oh, and look, you can see the Masterpiece Hangerback Walker he illustrated in the background of the Masterpiece Steel Overseer he illustrated. That's pretty neato. He also did a bunch of the special lands for the new Zendikar set, which means we've got these cool art cards to go along with them that have his signature. It's a pretty good signature, highly legible and stylized, but not overly contrived. As you can guess by his work's inclusion in the newest set, he is still very active and has a site dedicated just to his Magic illustrations. I genuinely try really hard to find actual concrete proof of an artist's medium rather than speculate, since you would be surprised how often you might guess incorrectly, and since this is a fact-based show with rigorous hoop jumping. But due to my extensive knowledge of looking at things, I feel pretty confident that our ghost-powered mannequin is painted digitally. By lurking on Adam's various social media accounts, it's clear that he is a very competent oil painter. I'm not sure why he chose to do this piece digitally, but he has not yet responded to my emails. The lighting is really the dominant element in this piece, with the warm brown and golden hues contrasting against the bright bluish light emitted from the vessel, which appears to contain the ghost energy. That vessel actually looks kind of familiar now that I think about it. The vessel also looks a whole lot like those featured on Geistcatcher's rig, which has flavor text alluding to these spirit batteries being used by crazy inventors. The important thing to keep in mind here, though, is that busting makes us feel good. How else are you going to get your unicycle scarecrow's ceiling fan hands to rotate at 1000 RPMs? The face of this rolling pin cushion is ominously devoid of most features, like some kind of nameless, mask-wearing creep. The wheel he's riding on actually looks like something out of Kaladesh, and it makes sense that Adam made so many pieces for that plane. The tricorn hat helps place this figure into a distinctly old-timey setting, and the trench coat gives clear form to what I imagine is actually just a pile of straw. It's cute how the straw sticks up around the collar, and it's obviously ridiculous how its whirling hand blades are repelling what look to be very docile and elegant crows. Our gizmo duck-looking friend appears to be racing down a dirt path cut directly into a field of wheat, implying that it patrols these fields in a regular fashion. Overall, the piece reads well, is well executed, and feels finished. Stylistically, this is what some might consider modern fantasy illustration, owing less to a particular school of art than to the needs of the work to depict action, characters, and setting. As I said before, this painting is really all about the lighting, and that's where I think the best moments are found. The warm band of light that falls along the brass mechanism, and the blue line that traces the edge of the Scarecrow's left arm. Otherwise, as a professionally made work of consumer art, every element in the painting is used intentionally to achieve a specific goal. The grain which the Scarecrow is protecting sandwich the central figure on both sides, pulling our focus inward. The receding path in the background is hazy with distance and helps to create perspective. The crows themselves are all looking towards the primary figure and create a triangle which helps to balance the piece and again emphasize that the Scarecrow is the main course. Both the angle at which our avian frightener leans, the subtle dust being kicked up by its big wheel, and the blurring of the fan blades give this piece a clear sense of motion, specifically the motion of the Scarecrow moving towards us and the motion of its hands whipping around at insane speeds. While prominent elements like the coat, which billows and flaps pleasantly with picturesque wear and tear, are represented more than adequately, I can't help but wish that the dramatic clouds hiding in the background weren't given more room to shine. Looking through Adam's catalog, it's clear that grand vistas are something he excels at, and in these lustrous clouds tucked between coy birds and a propeller-wielding piñata cart, we can see fragments of this grandness peeking through. Seriously though, look at how cute this bird is. He looks like he just left a note in your school locker. I'd go to prom with that bird. Geist-Fueled Scarecrow is the 31st Scarecrow printed in Magic's history. The first Scarecrow was the card Scarecrow. Wow, this card is terrible. Thanks, the dark. The second Scarecrow card ever printed is Straw Soldiers, a card from Portal 3 Kingdoms, which was originally just a Soldiers, but has since been reclassified as a Scarecrow Soldiers, which is pretty cute, and obviously very out of place with every other Scarecrow, which are artifact creatures. The next 23 Scarecrows are from Lorwyn Asterix Shadowmoor, before we finally get to the Scarecrows of Innistrad, which are more similar to what most people think of as a Scarecrow, and less like a pile of sticks, with animal skulls jumbled in. Seriously, what is going on with some of these Shadowmoor Scarecrows? Oh hey, it's a Joshua Hagler illustration. Looking at the many different Scarecrows from the first and second visit to Innistrad, it's hard to pick a favorite, because they're all outstanding in their field. But for the purpose of this video, let's say that Geist-Fueled Scarecrow takes the cake. The community certainly seems to agree. People flippin' love this guy. Being an artifact creature, it's pretty sensible for Scarecrows, since they are literally sapient creatures made out of inanimate objects. Artifact creatures date back to the very first set, Alpha, where we see such well-known cards as Clockwork Beast, Obsanius Golem, Juggernaut, and this card, which deeply disturbed me as a child. It wasn't until 6th edition when they started giving artifact creatures subtypes, like other creatures, which allowed for the rise of such classic tribes as golems, juggernauts, myr, thopters, triskelevites, tetravites, petavites, and prisms. Among all of these notable artifact creature tribes, Scarecrows are one of them. Scarecrows don't have the most coherent tribal identity, but one thing which very flavorfully crops up on the original Scarecrow, as well as a few Scarecrows from Innistrad, is this tendency to repel or disable other creatures. One-Eyed Scarecrow and the original Scarecrow both specifically remove power from flying creatures, which is kind of a slam dunk as far as flavor goes. The notorious GFS doesn't specifically interact with flyers, despite what the art depicts, but instead simply repels all creatures. Most specifically, it repels your creatures by making them harder to cast. Wow, I'm already starting to hint at what this card does. Making cards cost more to cast is sometimes called being taxed, and it is a popular strategy in decks like Death and Taxes, Eldrazi and Taxes, and the classic Stax archetype, which has the word tax right in its name. Surprisingly though, Stax isn't named Stax because it involves taxing. Many people seem to think that Stax is called Stax because of the card Smokestack, but according to an article on MTG Salvation by Lunar from 2005, the original name of the deck was the $4,000 Solution, which was abbreviated as $T4KS. It was named this because due to running 8 out of the 9 Power 9 cards, the deck cost $4,000. This deck would cost between $15,000 and $23,000 today. In the dystopian nightmare reality reality that is the year 2020. Although it should be noted that the single basic island that the deck contains probably costs the same, if not less. Considering all of this, it's possible that Stacks decks should be renamed to the $15,000 solution, which would be abbreviated as Sticks. Normally a card which has a taxing effect will be symmetrical though, and it's up to the deck builder to find a way to break that symmetry. There are a number of asymmetrical taxing effects, and among them are some which just tax you, the controller of the card. If you're watching this video and you've never played Magic the Gathering before, this notion might sound odd. Why would you play a card that makes the rest of your cards cost more? Well, to begin with, I'm amazed that you've gotten this far into the video despite having no previous knowledge of Magic. Secondly though, you would play that card because it has a beefy 4 power and a burly 4 toughness, despite only costing 4 generic mana. And it came out 4 years ago, and 4 months ago, and 4 days ago. Wow, what a coincidence. Throughout the 10 plus years of Magic's history, there have been a number of self-taxing cards, though with a range of cost to power ratios. The example which first comes to my mind is the Leech Cycle from Invasion. These were a series of monocolored creatures that make spells that shared a color with them cost more. Apparently they were rares. Yikes. I did not realize they were rares. I guess they are all named after rare gems. It would actually make a lot of sense if they had named these to match the Moxen. Ruby and Sapphire are the same, but I'm not sure why they didn't just go with Emerald, Jet, and Pearl. Jade and Alabaster sound cool, but what the hell is androdite? Okay, so I just went and read about androdite, and it is a very cool mineral. So I can see where they were coming from with that, but still, it's kind of esoteric. Androdite does occur in Skarns, though. Skarn is a word I am shocked has never appeared on a Magic card. Anyways, these cards are built upon a similar premise as Geistfield Scarecrow, where the body is more than what you would normally get for the price. If you wanted a 2/2 blue flyer, you'd have to pay at least 3 mana most of the time. That's a standard which actually still holds up pretty well. You can get a blue 2/2 flyer for 3 mana with upside, but most 2/2 flyers for 2 mana are going to have some kind of downside. Is the downside going to be as bad as making all of your blue spells cost more? Probably not. So now we turn back to Geistfield Scarecrow, which in many ways is like a colorless leech. An even more similar card is Daralore, a card which I have not seen in a long time, and which I am very happy to now be forcing you to look at. But outside of this mutant horse thing, and our friends the leeches, self-taxing is actually exceedingly rare. It's also worth mentioning that Daralore is also a rare card, so you can tell that Wizards of the Coast really thinks this sort of thing is a hot commodity. So we should count ourselves lucky that Geistfield Scarecrow is merely an uncommon. And on top of that, it only taxes creatures. That's big game. Just how uncommon is it to get a 4/4 for 4 generic mana though? Pretty uncommon. In the 5+ year history of Magic the Gathering, there have only ever been 12 artifact creatures with these exact stats, and Geistfield Scarecrow ranks pretty highly among them. How highly? Maybe 5th? It's actually really hard to come up with a good ranking. Number 1 is definitely Masticore. This is easily the most well known among the 12 4/4s for 4. You can buy a gold bordered Masticore from Kai Budei's 1999 World Championship deck. The ability to deal 1 damage to any creature for 2 mana is pretty strong, and regeneration is pretty cool. Number 2 probably isn't Molten Tail Masticore, which is a retread of the basic design of Masticore, but with a much more balanced first ability. I'm going to mention it here though, because it's a lot easier than talking about them separately. Up next is Su-Chi, who's the real deal. No drawback, 4/4 for 4 uncommon. We could rank this lower because of the time of its original printing. The 4 mana it would generate upon dying could become a liability in the form of mana burn. The card also clearly has a lot of combo potential, with different sack outlets and ways to recur both creatures and artifacts. The original artwork is also insane, and because it's on the reserve list, it is easily the most expensive 4/4 for 4, coming in at a whopping 60 American dollar dues. Up next I've got Myriad Construct, which I've never played with since it's a relatively new card, and I haven't really drafted much Zendikar Rising. This is probably the purest example of a 4/4 for 4 with no drawback at all. It actually has upside, since it makes little babies when it dies, and you can kick it to make it have +1/+1 counters. That's pretty neat. Up next is where Geistfield Scarecrow could really be in contention. Volatile Rig and Synod Centurion both have what seem like more dramatic drawbacks, but the possibility of having Volatile Rig wipe the board when it dies seems like it could be a big upside, although unpredictable and situational. Synod Centurion could just literally die, but when it was printed in 5th Dawn, a set all about artifacts, it was likely pretty easy to keep it alive. Golden Guardian from Rivals of Ixalan is a very odd card, and it was good in that limited format, but the way it functions is unique enough that I don't know if I can really compare it with the rest of these hulking contraptions. I'm going to go out on a limb here though and say that Complex Automaton, Hollow Warrior, and Rust Elemental are definitely worse than Geistfield Scarecrow. The flying on Rust Elemental is huge, especially for a deck looking to beat face, but the downside of sacrificing artifacts and taking damage is pretty harsh. The Automaton is likely going to be your 5th permanent, so the requirement that you can only have 2 other permanents is pretty limiting. Hollow Warrior is basically a vehicle, which is pretty cool. I'm not going to talk about Cogwork Tracker because it involves conspiracy draft rules, and I'm already on like the 7th page of the script, so let's just move on. Ultimately, I'd say that if you're looking for a 4/4 for 4, then Geistfield Scarecrow is definitely probably at least 7th out of 12. And if we look exclusively at the other uncommon 4/4s for 4, well then it's likely 2nd or 3rd best, especially if we consider mana burn a strike against Su-Chi, which we shouldn't, but if it makes Geistfield Scarecrow seem better? Then okay, let's do that. So when I first set my eyes upon this card, and some of my rankings kind of imply this, the first thing I thought about was limited. Playing above rate creatures is really important in draft, where creatures tend to make up a larger portion of decks, and combat is usually how games are decided. Getting a 4/4 for 4 that can go in any deck is pretty decent, although it does make your subsequent creatures harder to play. There are some very plausible best case scenarios that make playing Geistfield Scarecrow in a limited deck appealing. At 4 CMC, it's possible that Geistfield Scarecrow will be near the top of your curve, and you can play out your 2 and 3 drops before playing Geistfield Scarecrow to dominate the board. You might not even have that many creatures left to play after you get enough mana to cast Geistfield Scarecrow, and then if you do draw a 2-drop, playing it for 3 really isn't that bad. The next great scenario for you will be to slap down a Geistfield Scarecrow and then trade with something that costs more. Eldritch Moon has a lot of 5-drops with 4 toughness. The set actually has 3 8-drops with 4 toughness. The important thing to note is that if you play a 4/4 for 4 and then trade off with a 4/4 for 5, you've made a great deal, avoided the taxing downside, and now you have an artifact and a creature in your graveyard, which is relevant for the ability Delirium, which is present in both Shadows over Innistrad and also Eldritch Moon, and cares about the kinds of permanents in your graveyard. This tiny voice in the back of my head wants to mention that you could also skirt around the downside of Geistfield Scarecrow by simply not playing many creatures, but that's not a formula that tends to succeed in most limited environments. So yeah, overall the card is good. Is it great? No, but it is good. And in addition to being good, it's also bad. Which brings us to the second application that Geistfield Scarecrow has, which is as a wonderful gift. Some of you might see Geistfield Scarecrow and be reminded of another undercosted artifact creature named Steel Golem. The artwork for Steel Golem was originally supposed to be used for Karn, who is a silver golem. But somebody wisely looked at this creepy alien guy and decided to use this art elsewhere. I personally do not want to be anywhere near this guy because he weirds me out, big time. Maybe that's why Steel Golem doesn't let you play creatures, because nobody wants to spend time with him. A 3/4 for 3 is a good rate though, especially the further back you go, but the downside is huge. So sneaky Magic players will often do this silly thing where they donate the Steel Golem to their opponent and let them deal with the downside. You could see a similar thing happening with other cards like this, including our crow antagonizing friend from Eldritch Moon. And unsurprisingly on EDH Rec, Geistfield Scarecrow is showing up most frequently in Reaper King decks and Zedru decks, since Zedru gives people things, and the Reaper King cares about scarecrows. I have a Reaper King deck. I do not play Geistfield Scarecrow in it. With the recent printing of Blim, who also likes to give opponents things, I assume we'll see some amount of Geistfield Crow scaring amongst those deck lists as well. The reality though is that there are much more devious things to gift, so perhaps Geistfield Scarecrow will be relegated to budget lists, as it is currently selling for a hair less than an American quarter. As an uncommon, it is not legal in Pauper. It is legal in every other format where it could see play though. It's not restricted in Vintage, so you can play 4 copies there, which sounds insane, but Mishra's Workshop makes a lot of 4-mana artifacts suddenly a lot better than they seem. It should also be noted that paying 1 more for creatures does occasionally have upsides. If an opponent controls Lavinia Azorius Renegade, you won't be able to cast your creatures for 0, but with Geistfield Scarecrow on the board, you can pay 1 extra and play as many Kobolds and Memnites as you'd like. Knowing where to end these videos is always a challenge, although my use of the word challenge might be a bit of hyperbole, because everything about this endeavor is completely optional, arbitrary, and without consequence. We are fortunate to have a piece of excellent flavor text featured on our ectoplasm-consuming haystack.
It'll keep the crows away. Works on the neighbors too.
This flavor text is good on multiple levels. It relates to the source material for the card as well as its functionality. The quote is funny, but not in a way which detracts from the spooky setting of Innistrad. If anything, the notion of trying to keep your neighbors away adds to the feeling of isolation and distrust that help make the gothic horrors of this grim world harder to bear. In case you're wondering, there is no card for Old Rutstein, but he has similarly excellent flavor text featured throughout Innistrad's 2 blocks, including on Crow of Dark Tidings, which features birds that I wouldn't go to prom with. Despite not being featured on a card himself, I would like to suggest that Old Rutstein is an entirely successful addition to the game though. Anybody who has seen their fair share of horror movies will recognize his role. Not a combatant, a victim, or a hero, but the old man who gives ominous warnings with a sly smile on his face. Old Rutstein, and every old something or other who appears jarringly before the protagonists of any good horror story, exists outside the stakes of the narrative's dangers. A carriage rider looks to traverse the Cruin Pass, and Old Rutstein says, that might not be a great idea. An inquisitive maiden wants to open an antique bottle, and Old Rutstein doesn't object, but jocularly insists that for what it's worth, he wouldn't take that course of action himself. 2 teenagers venture to sneak through a field of shoulder-height wheat, and Old Rutstein is there to cast doubts upon the wisdom of that plan. You'd be better staying out of that field, unless you're interested in having an encounter with the Geist-fueled Scarecrow. It is not a contraption built for battle, but let's just say it's hard to hug somebody when your hands are spinning blades. Hey everybody, thank you. That is the end of episode number 3. I am the first to admit that was way too long. I tried to still produce it with the same level of quality throughout. I'm going to try and not exceed 15 minutes in the future. Anyways, I have to wrap this up because I don't want to exceed 30 minutes for the total video. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for watching. I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you next time on Imagine.